Good morning, everybody, and I'm up here clutching this little bit of paper with scribbles all over it because throughout Julia's presentation and Matt's presentation I was supposed to go yes and writing stuff down, and I must confess, if I was putting my presentation together now, having just had their presentations, it probably would be in a different order and there'd be some different stuff, but we'll kind of just wing it as we go through. But I guess to echo some of the stuff that Julia said, I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that the food industry is not in a state of massive change. But I also think we're underselling just how exciting an opportunity that presents for us. You know, I love food and I love the food sector. I grew up on a farm, and you know, I remember probably when I was about 7 or 8, my parents, who worked full time, they also had a farm, they gave me the choice of whether I would stay inside when we got home from school and work each day in winter and get dinner ready, or whether I would go out and help feed out hay. So that was a really easy decision, and so at about 8 I became the kind of chief cook for the house, and my 6-year-old sister got to go out and try and push the farm bike through the mud holes. So you pretty quickly worked, for me anyway, this was something that I loved food. I loved making food for people and having people enjoy the thought and the care and the preparation that had gone into it. And so ever since, I've been working in something to do with food. For me, I think that it is really fascinating how food brings people together, but it also can pull people apart. And I think we've got ourselves in a position in New Zealand at the moment where food is really driving apart communities and different families about the positions that we have on it. And I think we need to find a way to get more constructive conversations together. You know, we were talking about, or Julie was talking about the cellular agriculture earlier, and I was with a guy who is a winemaker down in Martinborough the other day, and he said to me that he'd just been over in San Diego at a company, a startup that does synthetic whiskey, and he said that synthetic whiskey was phenomenal. And he said they knew he was coming, and so they spent 2 hours before he got there putting together some wine out of the top 200 components in their sort of library. So they kind of pulled up what the chemical composition of wine was, and they pulled down the sort of top 200 most sort of or highest in volume, I guess you could say, synthetic components in wine, mixed it all together and gave it to him. And he said if one of his junior winemakers had made that wine, he would have told them, "Good job, keep it up, you're doing really well." He said that was 2 hours work. What would they get in terms of the quality of that if they spent 2 days on it? What about 2 weeks? And he said what that told him is we've got to get away from just relying on taste and flavour to be able to sell our products. Because if we cannot communicate to the consumers in a way that is going to make them pay more for something, so if we cannot pick the discerning consumers who care about our values, which is what Julia was saying, why would they go for our natural one over that kind of the synthetic stuff that tastes great but could taste exactly the same? And so that, I think, is an entire sort of story we've got to work through. And I think Matt was absolutely right. We've got to stop being us against the neighbour, or us against the company down the way, or our region against the region next door, or the region North Island against South Island. We need to have New Zealand against the rest of the world. And I find it really interesting that as a country we often talk about ourselves as being good collaborators, and people who visit here say we're open and engaging and friendly, and it's like, yes, we're all those things. We're open, we're engaging, we're friendly, but we are revoltingly bad collaborators, because collaboration is about admitting vulnerability. It's about opening ourselves up and saying, I don't know all the answers, and in fact I've got an idea, like Julia said, and it might be a rubbish one, but I'm going to share it with you anyway, and then maybe you can tell me what you think and we might be able to work on it together to make it better. In New Zealand we have a history of celebrating man in a shed does it alone, and we say, wasn't that phenomenal? We don't say, well, he could have done it with half the money and a third of the time if he'd worked with the man in the shed next door. And so I think that there's a lot of stuff that we've got to change about the culture of how we work in the food sector. And I don't have the answers for all of it, but I'm really delighted to be working in FoodHQ, which is, I've been in this role now for 18 months, which to me is really about one part of the overall sort of continuum in the food sector, and that's focusing on this relationship between science and business. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. The key thing was I was trying to make the point that, you know what do we really want in the food sector? We want to have thriving regional communities that are doing really well on the back of a successful food industry that is capturing more value in the regions. And I think there's an awful lot of talk about us wanting to export higher value premium products. And I think yes, but we also want to make sure that those higher value premium products are returning that value to the people and the communities that it needs to be in. Because, you know, no offence to the people who live in Auckland, but we need to be able to not just be taking stuff out of regions, taking it to Auckland, having someone there process it and stick it on a ship or a plane, and that is where the jobs and the money and everything stay. We need to make sure we're actually getting stuff to go back to where the products have come from. More Māori businesses are succeeding internationally with food and beverage products that embody Mataranga Māori. We have got some unique stories, culture, heritage that, you know, no one else in the world has that stuff. And yet, while there is, I think, a really interesting and encouraging groundswell of interest within Māori communities for how to make better use of the lands that they've got, you know, there's still, I think, a lot of missed opportunity to be working with those groups in a way that's going to support their ambitions, to help look at how that can really bring value back to our communities. Because often those Māori groups are the ones who are doing that long-term thinking, who are thinking about what can we do now that's going to be the right thing for the next 50, 100 years to come. And I do think that if we can have more of those groups succeed, the benefit back into our communities and into our people is going to be, you know, phenomenal. Increasing numbers, scale and profitability of food-related businesses, inwards flow of venture capital and investment to support business growth. Capital in New Zealand is a really tough thing to get hold of. But I think that we're becoming more of, or people are becoming more aware of just what exciting things are going on here. I think we're becoming more, shall we say, willing to go and tell our story internationally. My colleague Amos, who's currently spending 3 months over in the Netherlands with Food Valley in Wageningen, he used to work for the Israeli embassy in New Zealand before he joined FoodHQ. And part of what he was doing was taking delegations over to Israel to look for opportunities for Israeli and New Zealand companies to work together. And he said it was really interesting because you'd go over there and you'd have all of these companies pitching to you about, you know, what their science was or their tech that they'd developed or what they're doing. And he said it would be mind-blowing. You sit there and go, wow. And then someone within the group would quietly say, yeah, my neighbour's doing that stuff and he's more advanced than that. Or, yeah, that's what we're doing. Did you want to look at my one? And it would be 10 times better. But in Israel, you have an idea and you go out there and you talk to people about it and you're out trying to get people to invest in things or to help you develop it further or to collaborate with you right from day dot. And in New Zealand, we're that humble kind of self-assuming nature, which we all, and internationally wins us a lot of friends, also means often we spend a lot of time trying to get something perfect before we will sell it. And I think it means that often we don't take the collaborative opportunities or the external investment opportunities that we could get. We want rewarding and diverse career pathways for talented young New Zealanders in the agri-food sector, so that they don't think that when I grow up I want to be a social influencer or I need to move to a big city in order to have a rewarding job. You know, how do we get smart kids thinking the agri-food sector has so many interesting things going on, whether I want to build robots or develop a marketing strategy or be actually involved in managing kind of the training and career pathways of new people coming through, or out in the outdoors growing stuff, or whatever it might be that I'm wanting to do and where I've got my natural inclinations. There is a role within the agri-food sector that would suit me. And we want consumers, both in New Zealand and overseas, to be positively engaged with where their New Zealand food comes from. You know, I think we've got to make sure that our food sector feels proud to be able to tell their neighbours, their friends and their wider family that that's what they're part of. I was at an event the other day where one of Manawatū's sort of most well-known and really sort of stellar dairy farmers admitted to me that when he is at when he is at dinner parties these days and people ask what he does, he says he's an Angora goat farmer, because he just can't handle being then dumped on about the dairy farming industry in New Zealand and all the damage it's doing things. And actually, you know, he is that top 10% that Julia mentioned that is doing phenomenal stuff, but he just feels it's just all too hard right now. And we want New Zealand to be recognised as a world leader in balancing the production of the highest quality food with the regeneration of our natural resources. You know, we want to be proud to be New Zealanders, and I think that's we are not going to move away from being a food producing nation anytime soon. So how do we have the utmost pride in that position as a food producing nation? So basically what my sort of undercurrent here was all about is that we need science and business to work together to keep developing differentiated high quality products in their value chains. And when I talk about differentiation, it's because fundamentally we want to do things that are going to enable a consumer to pick our one rather than the one that's coming from somewhere else. And we want there to be something about that product that is going to ensure that they're able to keep choosing our one, because the guy next door in Australia, heaven forbid, or whatever other country around the world doesn't look at our one and say, oh, that's selling well, I'll just do exactly the same thing. You know, there needs to be a barrier to entry or a barrier to copying, something that is unique about what we're doing. And I think that can happen anywhere along the value chain. It can happen from all sorts of different sort of angles, and science is one of them, but it can be a really, really important and useful one. Basically, FoodHQ is really around, you know, the tagline, New Zealand's smartest food science minds working together to drive innovation. It's a partnership between the names you will recognise: Mass University, AgResearch, Plant and Food Research, the Riddett Institute, the New Zealand Food Safety Science Research Centre, Cawthron, ESR, and the New Zealand Food Innovation Network, and others that are representing the sort of the science ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem across New Zealand that focuses on food. We reckon there's probably about 70% of the research and innovation support agent capacity in New Zealand in food that's part of it. And it's recognising we need to look at working together in order to do things differently. We have had this system in the past where KPIs and funding has incentivised individual organisations to effectively work in silos. You know, you do your own thing and you kind of actually compete against each other in order to get that contract with the government or that contract with a research with a company to do research. And that really has not driven the right kind of behaviours for the wider good or for the benefit of New Zealand and the food industry. Now, we can't change the way that things are necessarily set up, and there's often good reasons for why things have been set up, but what we have recognised is that there's an opportunity to potentially look to have sort of a neutral umbrella that sits over the top of these, that does not take away from the individual organisations and their brands and their strategies, but looks to provide sort of a facilitation, coordination, to try and bring people together in different ways, look for new opportunities to do things a little bit differently, and hopefully make it easier for companies such as your own or whoever out there to navigate all of the complexity that we've got that sits within those systems. We do also at the moment have Fonterra as what we call a member, and at the moment we have not got any other companies as members because we haven't gone and sought any. Fonterra has recognised the value in this for quite some time and therefore has been very generous in providing funding for us to help get this up and running. And what we're hoping is that over time we're going to be able to start having more companies come in as members, which effectively means that they're recognising value in what can be accessed through what we're trying to do, and therefore they're helping fund the work that we are undertaking. And then we've also got supporters, which tends to be the economic development agencies and councils and things where they're not actively involved, shall we say, in the doing, but they are very much invested in the overall success of the food industry. So across the FoodHQ partners, there's almost 2,500 people working in food, which actually gives us that kind of scale and critical mass that Matt was talking about as being really important if you're going to be able to have specialism and be able to start bouncing ideas off each other. We're mainly based in Palmerston North, but not exclusively. And the key objectives are really around increased value growth through embedding food science and innovation to generate premium products, attaining global relevance and recognition in our food science and innovation capability, not for its own right, but then leveraging that into the success for New Zealand firms, and providing easy access for food businesses to the full value of the New Zealand food science and innovation capability. And it was inspired by Wageningen in the Netherlands, and a lot of people have heard about the science ecosystem over in the Netherlands, which is basically now widely regarded as probably the most successful agri-food sort of hub in the world. And the observations there were really that magic happens at the intersection of deep expertise. So you really want to have people who have got really different perspectives bumping into each other and a culture that encourages them to be able to be open and to talk to each other and share ideas, and if they spark, to be actually able to go and do things together. And that there's a virtuous cycle of excellence and attraction of talent and R&D funding. And that once you start to get really interesting things happen, more people want to be part of that. And then as more people and more interesting things happen, more money tends to flow in because more people want to be part of that and more smart people want to be part of it too. And so there's a real opportunity there, I think, for the New Zealand agri-food sector if we can start trying to get that virtuous cycle going of pulling in more smart people and more funds and money into things as well, which we can then use for the right reasons to support our regional people. This is just a little slide which basically says we're concentrated in the Manawatū, but that's where the scientists are. That's not where our food regions are, our food sector is. I mean, yes, Manawatū likes to consider itself a holder of a large number of good soils and growing a lot of good food, but you know, on the overall scale of things, you know, you guys up here beat Manawatū hands down, but we won't tell them that. But fundamentally, we need to look at how do we leverage that critical mass and concentration of food science and innovation expertise in Manawatū and other parts of New Zealand for the benefit of the food industries in the region such as Gisborne. And then I guess it's just to remind me about the fact that it really is about going from the white coats, as we would say, from the lab, from the stuff that actually might seem a world removed from actual putting products on plates, through to the white gumboots, which is often the actual production or the processing or the post-harvest handling, because in the end, it is only if it is actually going to be relevant and able to be implemented will that white lab coat sort of science actually be able to have impact. So here this was just a little prompt for me to say that science is a very broad term, and I think that for a lot of people it can be quite intimidating. It can be quite sort of scary. They think that's the stuff that academics in sort of ivory towers get sort of all involved in that actually has got no relevance to me. But the key thing, as Julia said, we've got this unprecedented growth curve happening in technology and in what's possible in the world. And we need to be having science to be able to get the knowledge, to be able to respond to things and be able to change the way that we do things. And through the sort of what we normally talk about, the innovation or the sort of the more close to market sort of applied side of things, we tend to get iterative sort of improvements. You're kind of just taking something and you can see that it was green and then you're going to make it blue, or you can change something. But it is through the science that we actually tend to have true disruption. And so we need to be investing in science in order to ensure that we can stay relevant in the longer term. But there is a really big continuum between those really big sort of meaty science stuff all the way through to how do we simply look at applying the science that's already been done, that has identified better ways of doing things, to my circumstances in my business in order to help me do things better. I think that it was quite interesting, the comments that Julia made around diversification and land use and how do we try and consider perhaps what we should be growing, where we should be growing it, and all those sorts of things. And I very much believe, much like Julia said, that the future for New Zealand is going to be more heterogeneous. It's going to not be that we move away completely from what we're doing, and we're not going to stay doing completely what we're doing. We're going to be, there's room for both. But I also think that we need to be finding ways to communicate to consumers about what we're doing in better ways. And part of that, I think, is going to involve some science. I get really fed up when you go to almost anything, and even in the New Zealand media, and they're bagging the water and environmental impact effects of red meat and dairy using data that comes from factory-type farm systems over in the States. The problem is that we don't really have good data in New Zealand, and so it's very hard to suggest that they use our data instead. The problem, though, with consumers is that often consumers don't really care about data. They choose things based on their emotions, the sort of what resonates with them, and what that's easy to understand. And so I think that we've also got to be really realistic about the consumer science and the importance of really understanding who our consumers are, what they care about, what are the things that we choose to respond to, and where can we play in terms of the values that New Zealand as a collective, but also us as individually, where we're going to play. Now, I heard this term juggerniche a little while ago, which was some American kind of I was not going to say consultant who goes around and works with big companies, and he was using it to talk about the fact that multinationals in the States need to be agile in order to respond to different consumer groups, and that his suggestion was that under their structure of the multinational, they should actually have a whole lot of individual kind of departments that could target different consumer groups within for their overall business. And he talked about it as being a juggerniche, the niche groups that could then benefit from the overall economies of scale that could come from a multinational. I think a really interesting opportunity for New Zealand is to be a juggerniche country. From that food industry perspective, where we live now in a world where everyone wants to have stuff that is relevant to them. It's all about me, the generation of millennials, of this is what I want, and I want it the way I want it, when I want it, how I want it. And we have got the ability to connect to people wherever they are in the world via technology now, and find the tribe that's going to be kind of aligned with your value propositions and going to see what you're interested in. The key is, New Zealand is a country of SMEs, always have been, I think we probably always will be. We've struggled in the past to be able to find ways to get those economies of scale to support those SMEs in order to really try and enter those export markets, in order to be able to try and compete. And much like Matt said, there's real advantages in scale. The thing I think is the real trick for us, if we can find it, is how do we continue to allow our SMEs to do what they do really well, which is identify those niches, define their values, and get a really good product that for a particular group, and then get them to connect with that group, but also have access to the scale of the R&D and innovation support system to make that accessible to them. How do we help you develop your food ideas by connecting you with the right scientific resources to make them happen, and having that really tailored kind of curated approach where in the end Amos and we are not going to do the doing for you, but what we hopefully can do is through the wider FoodHQ network help connect you with the right people to be able to help you, and I'll come back to that more a little bit later on. And then this one here was just about connections, and it says they're joining forces to maximise opportunities. And I think, everywhere I go at the moment, people keep talking about connections, collaboration, the need to work together. How resources are too scarce. How do we avoid unintended duplication of effort? And if someone's doing something really well, let's not try and duplicate that, but how do we just try and find a way to connect them in and work together for the better good? And then this was pretty much a little diagram that we've been working on with the FoodHQ partners over the last sort of 6 months, which was trying to summarise the vision of what we would like to be able to try and offer the New Zealand food industry in a broader sense. And it's kind of more for internal use, and also discussing with government and things rather than sort of more directly at the food industry. But I thought it was useful to put up here to just kind of make a few comments about things. So part of it is around unleashing our collective potential, and that's from the food science and innovation support side of things, of how do we work better together? How do we ensure that you get access to the right people and the right equipment and the right knowledge and IP, irrespective of where you sit in New Zealand and what your sector is and where those particular things might sit within the current food ecosystem. Enriching our engagement with others. How do we then look at what we've got within that food science and innovation ecosystem and making it so much easier for you to be able to get in there? One of the things that we're trying to look at funding at the moment, and we're working with the Food Innovation Network on this, is wouldn't it be awesome if you didn't have to share Nikki with the entire west coast of the North Island, but actually Nikki just belonged to you guys, and Hawke's Bay had their own Nikki, and so did Wairarapa and virtually everywhere else, and that Nikki was then able to focusing much more of her time and resources on this area, on the individual companies here, but also those collective opportunities. And if those were all connected together across New Zealand and had that ability to concentrate and to focus, and we connected them together to be able to say, well, hang on a minute, in Gisborne there's a whole lot of people who are interested in this kind of thing, and also there's some of them in Taranaki who are also interested in that, and actually there's some in Canterbury too. What if we formed a little industry consortia on that particular thing, which enabled us to start doing some of those things at scale that we wouldn't be able to otherwise, in terms of perhaps investing in some better understanding of the consumers that we're going after, or perhaps looking at how we can have some technology adoption come in and be able to help us leverage what might be happening in a different sector but come into our sector in order to make things work better. How do we look to partner better internationally? I mean, I think that we've got to realise that there's enough big problems out there that we're not going to solve them on our own, and we need to be partnering with the best in the world to ensure that we're going to be able to do that. And so Wageningen is one of them over in the Netherlands, but also different areas throughout the world that we should be connecting with and trying to collaborate for mutual benefit. How do we then accelerate food business innovation? So working with businesses that are already in existence, or startups, or entrepreneurial individuals, to be able to help provide that technical support to complement the more general business support that there tends to be out there in regions anyway. And then finally, future-proofing our food science capability. And so this is saying that there are some key areas that are going to be really important for New Zealand to succeed in the food industry in future. We'd say things like sustainable packaging, plant-based food products, the relationship between food and health, and then the use of digital and data to drive insights in the food industry. And how do we try and more rapidly develop both the facilities and the capability within New Zealand to make those things accessible to the wider food industry? And so this was just my little diagram that kind of talked about the whole Nikki's in every region, but I just mentioned it before. But being able to try and have someone who you have got access to that is Nikki, I mean, Nikki's here. Nikki's fabulous. You were very lucky to have Nikki, but who with a remit to actually be able to help more broadly along the entire value chain as well. So that was me, because I'm very aware of the time, and there was all sorts of other things that I'm sure that I was going to talk about. But anyway, very happy to chat, and if you are at all interested in talking about anything to do with FoodHQ, opportunities to be connected into things, Nikki is a really good place to start, because Nikki and I talk quite frequently, or otherwise feel free to give me an email or call as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Abby. So the first question, have you got some ideas or examples of how industry can get away from doing it alone to collaborating?
I think there are little pockets of it happening all over the place. You know, there's one of the examples at the moment comes to mind is FIET, which is the Food Industry Enabling Technologies, FIET, which is a program that is funded by the government, run through MB. And it is little projects that are usually a couple of $1 million where different companies are working together with researchers in order to examine the potential for new technologies to have positive impacts on their industry. But most industry don't even know it exists. And so an example there would be they're looking at things to do with the development of atmospheric freeze drying, which would be a cheaper way of getting high quality food preserved, not using the capital that is required to invest in a new freeze dryer, traditional freeze dryer, and also not as much running costs. I think something like that would be really interesting to place in this region. Also looking at microwave technologies that would be able to preserve some food products in order to be able to get longer shelf life on them with less damage to the nutrition, flavour, colour, texture, etc. Actually, Ngāti Porou is involved in that one, so there's a link into this region here. But you know, there are those little consortia that are popping up already. I just think we need to get more of them.
One more question. What would you advise or suggest the one thing to change producers' commodity mindset?
That's a case-by-case thing to a certain extent. I mean, I think it depends on the producer and it depends on their circumstances. Sometimes I think the commodity mindset comes about because that's what we know and it's what we've got control over. And I think that in those instances, part of it is actually how do we get more case studies out of people who have done things differently and have succeeded and what they've learned and sometimes what they failed and what they learned to help get people perhaps a little more courage to be able to try. I think a key one is that whole thing about collaborating, finding other people who are interested in working together to do things differently so you can share risk, share ideas and potentially get that kind of scale to work together. But doing it in a way where you're not losing your own sense of identity and your own values. And I think that's a key thing. You don't need to give up it's like a marriage. It's not healthy to give up your own sense of identity. You still want to retain who you are and what you stand for, but that doesn't mean there's not value in working together. And I guess I should say, you know, we really don't know all the answers. All we're recognising is that the status quo is not working for us in the way that we think it needs to for the future. So let's start on a journey of trying to say, well, we know we want to do things differently. We know we want to work better together. We'll kind of work this out as we go along. And some of the things we're going to try will work, some things won't work so well. And hopefully we'll learn from them and find other ways to do things.